Some words of welcome. Come into this space of togetherness and belonging, where we are reminded of our interconnection, where we become part of something greater than ourselves. Come into this space of becoming and imagining, where we can bring our hopeful dreamings, our deepest yearnings for our lives and for our world. Come into this space where we can share our hopes and fears, our struggles and our joys, where everyone's hurt can be honored and everyone's voice can be heard. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, you are welcome here. So I don't know about you, but I've been struggling with winter this year. I struggle a bit with winter every year, but this year it seems a bit more, doesn't it? With what seems like a never-ending pandemic, when we're never sure if it's going to be safe to gather together. With news that doesn't seem to get any better. I hear that news consumption is now considered a health hazard. And underneath, or maybe hanging over it all, are the multiple crises we're facing, from climate change to racist backlash, increasing economic inequality to violent threats to democracy. In many ways, it's a winter of discontent for many of us. Even my cat seems dissatisfied these days. And I'm painfully aware from talking with my daughters that a sense of anxiety and uneasiness, even of hopelessness, is becoming pervasive among younger generations. That sense of hopelessness or futility, that things just aren't going to get any better. It's easy for me to go there when I get stuck in my own head, I know, when I get caught in my own worries or fixated on my own feelings or moods. And it certainly gets worse when I isolate myself and stop reaching out to other people, or when I give in to the inertia of just seeking comfort all the time on Netflix or in food, an aspect of the self-absorbed culture that I grew up with and have internalized and don't particularly love in myself. Hopelessness and isolation and inertia are all aspects of an inward focus on what's going on in here and what I'm thinking and feeling, rather than being out there and connecting with others, and engaging with life. This self-centered focus on me, myself, and I, this hyper-individualistic way of being is what Tima Okun and Kenneth Jones and others have identified as one of the core characteristics of white supremacy culture, in distinction to a way of being that balances a sense of self with a sense of community, that sees the self in the context of the larger communities in which we live and of which we are a part. As you may know, several years ago, the UUA commissioned a study on how white supremacy manifests itself among us as UUs. And the Commission on Institutional Change came out with a report in 2020 entitled Widening the Circle, which is this month's theme. The Widening the Circle report talks about the various ways that hyper-individualism can undermine our sense of community. Even things like the search for truth and meaning, when taken out of a communal context, can become sort of a free-for-all, anything goes mentality in which each individual defines their own reality without regard for its impact on others. A hyper-individualistic search for truth and meaning can lead to a breakdown of shared meaning as a community, and even worse, to a fragmentation of truth, arguably lending itself to the counterfactual denial of shared realities that plagues our society today. The Widening the Circle report goes on to argue that if freedom and individualism are our most important values, we have little to offer in these times. And when individualism is not balanced with communal good, it can become toxic to our life together. Robert Putnam, the author of Bowling Alone, you may have heard of, recently came up with a book called The Upswing. In this book, he argues, and he continues his argument from his earlier book, that our society is under this way of a individualistic mentality or way of being that both fosters and is reflected in the various social ills we are facing, from economic inequality, with everyone for themselves being a basic economic model, to political tribalism, a win or die, fight to the death mentality, with social disconnection and isolation and the breakdown of social trust, all rooted in a cultural inward me orientation. What's fascinating in Putnam's analysis is not just that we are caught in a cycle of hyper-individualism, but his argument that we have been here before as a society, during the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century, when people were also experiencing angst about inequality and tribalism and disconnection, similar to what we're experiencing now, and stuck in that same fundamentally individualistic mentality. What's even more fascinating and ultimately more hopeful about Putnam's latest book is his assertion that, which he backs up with a broad array of evidence, that we came out of this hyper-individualistic period at the end of the 19th century into a more collective or communal era, beginning with the progressive movement at the beginning of the 20th century, stretching through the New Deal and World War II all the way into the 1960s. This upswing began when people began to turn away from the excesses and inequities of the last Gilded Age. He even uses the term disgust to describe what people started to feel. And people became determined to do something about it. And he describes the broad range of ways that people took action that fostered a shift from an I-oriented culture to a more we-oriented culture. From muckraking journalists who exposed the horrors of child labor, meatpacking, and lynching, to everyday citizens getting involved in efforts to improve things, coming together to form unions and civic federations and organizations of all kinds, and experimenting with new and innovative ways of dealing with society's issues. Putnam describes it as an uprising of pragmatic hope, grounded in a shared sense that we are all in this together. This uprising led to an upswing, a kind of progressive reforms like women getting the right to vote, direct election of senators, the banning of child labor, the creation of labor unions, the introduction of the minimum wage and the 40-hour work week and Social Security and employment insurance. It goes on and on. A raft of things that were politically unimaginable even a few years prior. Now, it didn't happen all at once, but there was a significant and sustained transformation over time from a primarily I-oriented society to a somewhat more we-oriented society. It was an imperfect but significant shift, perhaps akin to what Albert Einstein talked about in terms of bursting the illusion of separateness and finding our relatedness, sort of his theory of human relativity. He said, Einstein said, a human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is kind of a prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to our affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from prison by widening the circle, widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. The true value of a human being is determined by the measure and the sense in which we have obtained liberation from the self. And you may recall another famous quote from Einstein: we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. We can't solve the problems of hyper-individualism by focusing on ourselves and our own problems. It's important to note, and Putnam notes, that progress on racial issues lag behind progress in other areas, reflecting the limits of who was included in the we at the time. And when racial progress finally peaked in the civil rights movement towards the end of the we era, the racist backlash was a huge part of what sent us back into another me era. Both that lag in racial progress and that racist backlash, not to mention the centrality of individualism and white supremacy culture itself, all these are why efforts to uproot white supremacy and widen the circle to include all of us in a greater we are so critical this time around. So what might a new era of we look like? I think perhaps seeds of it can be seen today in some of the same kinds of things that Putnam identified from the progressive era. In the modern day muckraking of writers like Michelle Alexander and Ta-Nehisi Coates, bringing into the mainstream the reality of the new Jim Crow of mass incarceration and the generational theft of billions of dollars from Black communities. I think seeds of a more we-oriented culture can be seen in the awakening, however tentative, of significant numbers of white people to the realities of systemic racism in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and others. I think seeds of a more we-oriented culture can be seen in the growing awareness that the 1% keep getting richer while the 99% keep getting poorer, and the unwillingness of more and more people to continue working in high-stress, low-paying jobs. Seeds can be seen in the rise of youth activism, like the Sunrise Movement and leaders like Greta Thunberg. As Bill McKibben points out, Thunberg is not alone. There are tens of thousands of young people on every continent stepping up to lead, and millions of young people are following them. Seeds of a new era can be seen in the rise of new movement organizations, just like the various associations formed in the progressive area. Movement organizations like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Indivisible, and mutual aid groups of all sorts, which are springing up all over in every part of the country. And seeds can be seen in various forms of prophetic yet pragmatic experimentation and innovation happening. Innovation towards new forms of public safety through less punitive and more restorative or transformative forms of justice. Efforts towards at least a more enlightened form of stakeholder capitalism, if not the possibility of a more democratic economy geared toward taking care of the people and the planet. Experiments like deep canvassing that move us away from trying to argue each other into submission towards hearing each other and inviting each other into reflecting on what we really want for the people in our lives. These efforts may be indicators of potential shifts taking place in every sector of society, in each of the pillars that make up or hold up our social order. And as these pillars are shaken and reimagined, it may be possible to see the beginnings of a broader social shift. A shift rooted in a reorientation from a focus on me and myself towards an awareness that we are all in this together. From the idea that there's a deserving us and an undeserving them, towards an awareness that there's only all of us, and that us includes the earth that we are part of. From thinking that the way to succeed is by dominating and subduing others and the planet, towards an awareness that we need to take care of each other and the earth if we are to survive as a species. There's a new organization being formed called Third Act. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's dedicated to mobilizing the power of those of us who are 60 and older, who have a final act, a third act to play before the end of our lives. One of the speakers recently pointed out that some of these ideas are not so new. For many Catholics, the earth and the sun have been mother and brother since the time of St. Francis. While for many indigenous peoples around the world, this has always been the reality and the gift economy that came with it. And the modern idea of the earth as essentially a supply house and a sewer is actually quite new. And that's the thing, this hyper-individualism plaguing us now has not always been so predominant for humanity. It's not inevitable as the defining way of being. There have been times in both ancient and recent history when human beings have been less individualistic and me-oriented and more community-minded and we-oriented. I think that's the kind of shift it's ultimately going to take to get us through the crises that face us. And I believe it's a shift clearly aligned with our values, our UU values of compassion, interdependence, and community. And I'm happy to share with you that I'm seeing it in my work with UUs and others around the state. As executive director of UUANI, the UU Advocacy Network of Illinois, I'm fortunate to be in a position where I can see a growing sense of connection, both among us and in the wider movement. Central to UUANI's work is fostering connections among UUs and with others working for justice, particularly those who are marginalized in society. I'm seeing this growing sense of connectedness in the broad-based movement for justice that is growing across the state and across the country, much of which is coalescing around the very values we espouse as UUs. One example is the Illinois Climate Table, which some of your members are actually part of. It's one of several coalitions in Illinois that are growing and making the connections between our shared values and an array of issues facing us. There's a growing sense that we need to go beyond our individual perspectives and agendas and find ways to work together. That we need to focus not just on our own issues, but on our shared values and on our relationships with each other, and come together as part of a greater we. I'm seeing this shift among UU congregations as well. The UU congregation in Deerfield has gotten really clear that their future, indeed their very survival, depends on becoming a congregation that makes a difference in their community and in the world. They have a sense of urgency, both about their own survival and the future of the planet, which they see as inextricably connected. And so they have committed themselves as a congregation to acting on climate justice as racial justice as the core mission of their congregation. And they're currently convening meetings among all the groups in their congregation, from social justice to worship to RE, from the choir to sewing circles to small groups, to flesh out how they're going to live out their sense of we as a congregation. And they're building partnerships with organizations in the community, representing the larger we around them. Several years ago, the Unitarian congregation in Hinsdale committed itself to building connections within their congregation through one-to-one conversations. They began with the simple practice of talking with and listening to each other, sharing their stories about their lives and what was important to them. And this listening campaign by itself increased participation in social justice actions exponentially. And then when the question of whether to put up a Black Lives Matter sign came up several years ago, initially there was significant opposition within the congregation. But they took the time to work through that decision by continuing to talk with each other and to listen to each other. And they ended up not with a unanimous vote, but with an agreement that everyone could live with. And the sign went up. And now they're putting their collective intentions around both connection and justice into practice, with significant portions of their congregation involved in pen pal relationships with people in prison, with a strong team advocating with their legislators to reestablish parole in Illinois at the request of those in prison. A similar transformation has taken place at the UU congregation in Oak Park. A number of years ago, they started building a relational network for social justice in their congregation, which they now call their Faith in Action Network, of which everyone is a part. This network has been fueled not only by a sense of connection, but by a sense of that they can actually make a difference in the world when they show up together. They began by shifting from just making announcements about social justice to making personal invitations to each other about things that they could do together in partnership with community organizations. And now they have a track record of showing up together and in force for community efforts to reverse mass incarceration and to establish equality for people who are lesbian, gay, transsexual, bisexual, or queer, for efforts to support renewable energy and to make their community more welcoming to immigrants. They've shown up year after year, time after time, in force. Carbondale Unitarian Fellowship has launched several year-long congregation-wide campaigns dedicated to harnessing the power of we in their congregation for immigrant justice, and for democracy, and for mental health. The UU congregation in Rockford is involved with a community initiative dedicated to creating a culture of belonging in the Rockford community, to developing a sense of we in that community that includes everyone. I could go on and on. I know this congregation has been involved with the League of Women Voters and the Fox River Valley Initiative, and with UUANI's Vote Love efforts in 2020. I look forward to hearing what you're up to these days at the virtual coffee hour later on. All these efforts began with people talking to each other and listening to each other and working from a sense that we are in this together and that we can act together. As I say, I see this growing sense of connection and solidarity all across the state, and I'm seeing a growing sense of urgency that it's time to come together and to do something to build a better world. But what I believe we're struggling with these days is a sense of agency, of hope, that we actually can make a difference and build that better world, versus the sense that it's only getting worse and that all may soon be lost. I heard a podcast on New Year's Day that helped me reframe that very real sense of despair, which I feel from time to time. Researchers are finding that alongside COVID fatigue, there is a growing sense of resilience in society among those of us who have gone through the pandemic. That on the whole, we as a people are coming out stronger for having to deal with adversity. Facing adversity often makes people stronger, and it isn't just the pandemic. We've been enduring social unrest and political turmoil and economic shocks for decades now. Some of us and many of our parents and grandparents endured the Great Depression and came out stronger for it, or at least more resilient and resourceful. And Black, Indigenous, people of color, and others have endured all these and more for centuries and continue to generate creativity, inspiration, hope, and joy. Consider that while there will always be opposition, there is a growing movement among us determined to create a new future. A movement with a shared sense of urgency and agency and connection around values of worth and dignity, and justice and equity, compassion and interdependence, around building a society of we. It's not going to be easy. There will continue to be resistance and backlash. There always is. So what we need to do is to build resilience into our movements to keep us going for the long haul. And I believe that resiliency comes through building a sense of connection and connectedness among us, to building that sense that we are not alone, that we are part of a larger and more powerful we. Because that's the beauty of being part of a larger we. We are never alone. Ultimately, relationally, even organically, we are connected to each other by breath, by blood, by body, by spirit. We are all one. Widening the circle from I to we is an ancient idea, central to all religions. Rabbi Hillel put it this way over 2,000 years ago. If I'm not for myself, who will be? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Let us be for ourselves and for others, including the earth. For we are all part of the greater we. We're all part of the wider circle that has no end. And so now, as we go forward from this time together, may we carry with us the deep assurance that we are each beings of both worth and agency, and that we are part of a larger community of belonging and power. May we come together often and find in each other's eyes the warmth of community, the fire of commitment, and the light of the truth, that beyond the me, there is the we that makes us one.